Every man who's walked this earth long enough knows that sometimes our most faithful companions see things we cannot. Sometimes they lead us toward truths we'd rather leave buried. Jake Morrison had ridden these desert trails for 40 years, but he'd never seen his dog Buck act like this, whimpering, pacing, pulling him deeper into the wasteland where no decent man had reason to venture. Under the merciless sun, miles from civilization, Buck led him to something that defied explanation. A towering nest built from human bones and tattered clothing. As Jake stepped closer, the desert sand gave way beneath his boots, revealing fragments of a town's darkest secret. But what was this unholy construction, and why had his dog been so desperate to bring him here? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake Morrison pulled his worn leather hat lower against the morning sun as he studied the peculiar structure before him. Buck sat at his heels, no longer whimpering but alert, ears pricked forward like he was listening to something Jake couldn't hear. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through the bone fragments that jutted from the massive nest like broken teeth. He'd been riding this desert for most of his 62 years, first as a young ranch hand learning the trade from men who'd fought in wars he'd only read about, then as a cattle driver when the big ranches still moved herds across the territory. Later, as sheriff of Dry Creek for 23 years until his Martha passed and the weight of keeping peace in a dying town became more than his heart could bear. Now, 5 years into what folks politely called retirement, he spent his days checking fence lines for Old Man Henderson and his nights sitting on his porch, watching the desert swallow another day whole. But Buck had never led him anywhere like this before. The dog was a mystery himself, had shown up at Jake's door 3 years ago, half-starved and carrying scars that spoke of hard living. No collar, no owner stepping forward to claim him, just a lean German shepherd mix with intelligent brown eyes and an uncanny ability to read Jake's moods better than most people ever had. Martha would have loved him, would have spoiled him with table scraps and long conversations on the porch. Jake had named him Buck after an old partner who'd saved his life during a bank robbery in '92. A man who'd also known when to speak and when to simply be present. The artifact that had started this strange day rested now in Jake's saddlebag, a faded daguerreotype in a silver frame, the only photograph ever taken of his father. John Morrison had been a railroad detective, a man who'd chased train robbers and confidence men across 3 territories before settling down to raise cattle and a family. In the photograph, John stood beside a steam locomotive, his hand resting on the grip of a Colt .45, his eyes holding the same steady resolve Jake saw in his own mirror each morning. Martha had given him the photograph on their wedding day, a gift from his father's personal effects that had somehow made their way to her family's general store. "Thought you should have something of his to carry forward," she'd said, her voice soft with the understanding that came from loving a man haunted by the ghosts of duty. Jake had carried that photograph through 23 years of sheriffing, through gunfights and negotiations, through the long nights when the badge felt heavier than the gun on his hip. It had been there when he'd tracked down the Brennan gang after they'd robbed the First National, when he'd talked young Tommy Watson out of robbing Henderson's payroll, when he'd held Martha's hand in the doctor's office as she slipped away from cancer that no prayer or medicine could stop. This morning he'd tucked it into his saddlebag without knowing why, the same way Buck had started pacing at dawn without any apparent cause. Looking at the bone nest now, Jake wondered if some instincts ran deeper than conscious thought, if the photograph had somehow called him here, just as Buck's restlessness had pulled them both from their routine. The town of Dry Creek lay 15 miles to the southeast, though you'd hardly call it a town anymore. When Jake had first pinned on the badge, it boasted 3 saloons, 2 churches, a schoolhouse, and enough commerce to keep a man honest and busy. The railroad had brought prosperity for a while, cattle shipments heading east while settlers and supplies flowed west. But the silver mines played out, the railroad rerouted through Tombstone, and the young folks chased opportunity to cities that promised electric lights and indoor plumbing. Now Dry Creek counted maybe 200 souls on. A good day, most of them stubborn enough to stay put or too old to start over. Doc Jameson still treated everything from broken bones to broken hearts, though his hands shook more than they used to. Reverend Cole preached to congregations that grew smaller each Sunday. His sermons aimed at the faithful few who still believed God had a plan for forgotten places. Sarah Chen ran the general store with the same quiet efficiency her family had brought from California's gold fields, while Old Man Henderson held onto his ranch with the determination of a man who'd buried 3 wives and wasn't about to let the desert claim his legacy too. They all knew Jake, respected the badge he'd carried and the reputation he'd earned. But they also knew that some stories weren't meant to be shared over coffee and checker games. Every town had its secrets, its dark corners where decent folks didn't look too closely. Dry Creek was no different, except that its secrets seemed to run deeper than most, buried in the desert sand, like seeds waiting for the right conditions to bloom. The bone nest stood 12 feet high and nearly as wide, constructed with the kind of deliberate precision that spoke of intelligence and purpose. Human bones formed the foundation, femurs and rib cages interlocked like the framework of some unholy cathedral. Fragments of clothing had been woven between the bones, a child's dress, faded blue with tiny flowers, strips of leather that might have been chaps or boots, pieces of fabric in colors that had once been vibrant but now matched the desert's muted palette. At the peak of the structure, a human skull rested like a crown, its empty socket staring back toward the distant mountains. Buck whined softly, a sound that carried more warning than fear. Jake had learned to trust the dog's instincts. They'd kept him out of trouble more than once during their wanderings. But this felt different, more significant than the usual dangers of desert travel. This felt like standing at the edge of a story that had been waiting years to be told. The sand around the nest had been disturbed recently, churned by something large moving through it. Jake could see tracks leading away from the structure, but they disappeared into the harder ground beyond. Whatever had built this place was still out there, still active. The thought should have sent him riding back toward town, but something in his father's photograph seemed to whisper that some duties couldn't be abandoned, even in retirement. Jake dismounted and approached the nest on foot, his hand instinctively checking the position of his Colt. The revolver had been his constant companion for so many years that drawing it had become as natural as breathing, though he hoped those days were behind him. Buck followed, staying close to Jake's left side in a pattern they'd developed during their years together. The dog's nose worked constantly, cataloging scents that told stories Jake could only imagine. As they drew closer, Jake could see that the bones weren't randomly placed. Someone had arranged them with care, positioning each piece to create structural integrity while maintaining an artistic symmetry that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The skull at the top had been placed to face east, toward the rising sun, as if keeping watch over something precious or terrible. The clothing fragments told their own story. Jake recognized the style of some pieces, dresses and shirts that had been fashionable 20 or 30 years ago, when Dry Creek had been prosperous and growing. Other items looked much older, possibly dating back to the early days of settlement, when every piece of cloth was precious and mended until it fell apart. The variety suggested that whatever force had created this monument had been collecting for a very long time. Mei-Lin Chen didn't speak English well, but she understood numbers and patterns, Sarah explained as she sorted through the contents. She kept track because she believed that forgetting the dead dishonored their spirits. "Look at this," she handed Jake a hand-drawn map of the surrounding territory, dotted with red marks that indicated disappearance sites. The pattern was unmistakable. The marks formed a rough circle around the area where Jake had found the bone nest, with the frequency of incidents increasing in recent years. "Your father came to see my grandmother shortly before he died," Sarah continued. She gave him information about the disappearances, locations where people had vanished. He promised to stop whatever was taking them, but then he died, and nothing changed. If anything, it got worse. Jake studied the map, comparing it to the locations mentioned in his father's journal. The correlation was undeniable. John Morrison had been tracking the same pattern that Sarah's grandmother had documented, following a trail of victims that led directly to the bone nest. But understanding the scope of the problem only made it feel more overwhelming. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "My grandmother saw one of them once, one of the things your father wrote about. She was gathering herbs in the desert when she came across 3 figures moving through the sagebrush. They wore clothes that should have rotted decades ago, and their skin was the wrong color, too pale, like something that had been underground too long. When they turned toward her, she said their eyes were completely white, blind, but somehow still seeing everything." Bradley cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Sarah, you know how these stories grow over time. Fear can make people see things that aren't really there." "My grandmother wasn't given to flights of fancy," Sarah replied firmly. "She lived through floods and droughts, bandits and railroad wars. She knew the difference between reality and imagination. What she saw in the desert that day changed her, made her more careful about where she went and when. She died believing that something unnatural was hunting people in these lands, something that wouldn't stop until it was destroyed." Jake felt the weight of generations settling on his shoulders. His father had died trying to solve this mystery. Sarah's grandmother had documented it, and now it fell to him to finish what they'd started. The bone nest represented decades of accumulated victims, families who'd never learned what happened to their loved ones, a community that had chosen to look away rather than confront an uncomfortable truth. But confronting the truth meant accepting that the world contained forces that operated outside the boundaries of law and reason, that his badge and gun might be inadequate tools against something that had already killed a better man than he'd ever been. The magnitude of the challenge ahead felt overwhelming, but the alternative, allowing more people to disappear, more families to suffer, was unacceptable. Buck had been lying quietly beside Jake's chair, but now the dog rose and moved to the window, his hackles rising as he stared toward the desert. Whatever had been watching them at the bone nest had followed them back to town, and Jake suspected their investigation hadn't gone unnoticed. The real work was just beginning, and already they were running out of time. Jake left the sheriff's office with more questions than answers, and a growing sense that time was working against them. Sarah's grandmother's records painted a picture of systematic hunting that had accelerated in recent years, as if whatever controlled the bone nest was approaching some kind of completion. The thought of what might happen when that completion was reached sent cold fingers down Jake's spine, despite the desert heat. Buck remained agitated as they walked down Main Street, his ears constantly swiveling toward sounds Jake couldn't hear. The dog's behavior reminded Jake of horses before a tornado, nervous energy that spoke of approaching danger. Several townspeople nodded greeting as they passed, but Jake noticed how quickly their smiles faded when they saw his expression. Word traveled fast in a small town, and his visit to the sheriff's office hadn't gone unobserved. The church stood at the eastern end of town, its whitewashed walls and simple cross offering the kind of sanctuary that had anchored frontier communities. Since the first settlers arrived, Reverend Cole was tending his small garden behind the building, his grey beard streaked with soil as he worked to coax vegetables from the stubborn desert earth. He looked up as Jake approached, and something in the older man's eyes suggested he'd been expecting this visit. "Jake Morrison," Cole said, straightening with the careful movements of a man whose joints had been worn smooth by 7 decades of hard living. "I heard you and Buck took a long ride this morning. Found something out there in the wasteland, did you?" The question was casual, but Jake caught the underlying tension in Cole's voice. The Reverend was a careful man who measured his words like a pharmacist measuring medicine. Too little, and they had no effect. Too much, and they became dangerous. "Reverend, I need to ask you about something, Jake said, settling onto the wooden bench that Cole had built for moments when gardening became too much for his aging frame. How long have you been preaching in Dry Creek? 34 years come October, Cole replied, joining Jake on the bench. Arrived here as a young man full of fire and certainty about God's plan. The desert has a way of tempering both fire and certainty, but it teaches you other things in return. Jake pulled out his father's journal, noting how Cole's eyes fixed on it with recognition that went deeper than mere curiosity. You knew my father was investigating more than train robberies, didn't you? Cole was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folding over each other in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of secrets kept for decades. John Morrison came to see me 3 days before he died. He was carrying a burden heavier than any man should have to bear alone. Cole reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch, handling it with the reverence due to a holy relic. He left this with me, asked me to keep it safe in case something happened to him, made me promise to give it to his son if the boy ever came asking the right questions. Jake accepted the pouch with trembling hands. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a crude iron cross about 4 inches long. The metal was black with age, and strange symbols had been etched into the surface, the same angular markings Jake had, found on the bone fragments at the nest. But unlike those disturbing inscriptions, the symbols on the cross seemed to radiate a sense of peace and protection. Your father found that cross at one of the sites where people had disappeared, Cole explained. He believed it had been used as protection against whatever was taking them. The person who carried it survived longer than the others. Long enough to hide the cross where your father could find it. Jake turned the cross over in his hands, feeling an odd warmth that seemed to come from within the metal itself. You believe in this kind of protection, Reverend? I've been a man of God for most of my life, Jake. I've seen prayer work miracles and witnessed faith move mountains. But I've also learned that the world contains things that operate outside the boundaries of conventional religion. Cole gestured toward the desert that stretched beyond the town limits. Out there, in places where decent folks don't venture, older powers hold sway. Powers that existed before churches and crosses, before men tried to impose order on chaos. The Reverend stood and walked to a storage shed behind the church, returning with a bundle wrapped in canvas. Inside were more artifacts, additional iron crosses, vials of what looked like blessed water, pages covered with protective symbols, drawn in careful script. I've been preparing for this conversation for 30 years, Cole admitted. Your father made me promise to help his son if the fight ever continued to the next generation. These items were collected by travelers and missionaries who encountered similar threats in other territories. Iron forged in sacred fires, water blessed at sites of miracles, symbols drawn by holy men who understood that faith sometimes requires more practical applications. Jake examined the collection, noting how each item seemed to share the same quality of warmth and protection as his father's cross. How do you know these things work? Because in 34 years of ministering to this community, I've learned to recognize the signs when something unnatural is stirring. 3 times in those years, people have come to me speaking of strange encounters in the desert, figures that moved wrong, sounds that carried too far on still nights, dreams that felt more like warnings than imagination. Each time, I've given them these protections, and each time they've returned safely to town. Cole fixed Jake with a steady gaze that held both compassion and determination. But I've also learned that some battles can't be won through passive protection alone. Your father understood that. He knew that sometimes a man has to go into the darkness and face it directly, armed with faith and whatever tools he can gather. Buck suddenly stood and began pacing, his agitation increasing as the afternoon shadows grew longer. Jake followed. The dogs gazed toward the desert, where heat shimmer created the illusion of movement among the distant rocks and sagebrush. Something was out there watching the town, perhaps waiting for nightfall to make its next move. Reverend, I need to know, do you think we can actually stop this thing? My father tried and died for it. Sarah's grandmother documented it for decades. without being able to prevent it. What makes you think this time will be different? Cole was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. Because this time, you're not fighting alone. Your father was a single man with limited resources and no real understanding of what he faced. But you have allies now. Sheriff Bradley, Sarah's knowledge, my collection of protective items, and 30 years of accumulated evidence about how this creature operates. The Reverend's voice grew stronger, taking on the cadence of a man accustomed to delivering sermons. More importantly, you have something your father lacked: advance warning. He stumbled onto this mystery in the final stages of his investigation, when time was running out and the enemy held all the advantages. You're starting with knowledge, with preparation time, with the ability to choose when and how to engage. Jake felt some of the overwhelming dread lifting from his shoulders, replaced by something that resembled hope. Cole was right. This wasn't the desperate last stand his father had faced. They had time to plan, resources to draw upon, and most importantly, they knew what they were fighting. But as the sun continued its descent toward the western horizon, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that their enemy was also preparing, gathering strength for a confrontation that had been 30 years in the making. The bone nest hadn't been built as a monument to past victims. It was a foundation for something larger, something that would soon require a final sacrifice to reach completion. The protective cross grew warm in Jake's hand, responding to his thoughts like a living thing. Whatever power had forged it understood the nature of the battle ahead, and was offering what help it could provide. But in the end, iron and faith would only carry a man so far into the darkness. The rest would depend on courage, determination, and the kind of sacrifice that defined one generation's duty to the next. The first sign that their enemy was aware of the investigation came at sunset, when Jake found the mutilated rabbit on his front porch. The animal had been arranged with the same deliberate precision he'd seen at the bone nest. Its body positioned to face east, its internal organs removed and arranged in a careful pattern around the corpse. But it was the message carved into his porch boards that made Jake's blood run cold. 3 symbols had been gouged deep into the weathered wood, the same angular markings he'd seen on the bone fragments and his father's protective cross. But these symbols felt different, aggressive. Rather than protective, warning rather than blessing. Buck circled the display with his hackles raised, whining in a tone Jake had never heard from the normally steady dog. Jake buried the rabbit's remains in his backyard while the last light faded from the western sky. But he left the carved symbols untouched. They were evidence, proof that whatever controlled the bone nest was intelligent enough to track his movements and confident enough to issue threats. The message was clear: back away from the investigation or face the same fate as the rabbit. But Jake Morrison hadn't backed down from threats during 23 years of wearing a badge, and retirement hadn't changed that fundamental aspect of his character. If anything, finding his father's journal and learning the truth about John Morrison's death had strengthened his resolve. This fight had been passed down from father to son, and Jake intended to end it once and for all. The night brought visitors. Jake was cleaning his father's colt. He'd retrieved it from the bone nest, along with the badge and journal, when Buck began growling low in his throat. The dog positioned himself between Jake and the front window, every muscle tense with protective, instinctive. Outside, the desert night carried sounds that had no place in the natural world. Footsteps circled the house, but they moved with an uneven rhythm that suggested the walker's limbs didn't quite function properly. The scraping sound of something being dragged accompanied the footsteps, as if whatever was outside couldn't entirely support its own weight. Most disturbing of all were the voices, whispered conversations in a language Jake didn't recognize, punctuated by sounds that might have been laughter if they'd come from anything remotely human. Jake extinguished his oil lamp and moved to the window, peering carefully through a gap in the curtains. 3 figures stood in his yard, their forms barely visible in the starlight. They wore clothing from different eras. one dressed like a railroad worker from the 1880s, another in the simple dress of a frontier woman, the third in the dust-covered clothes of a recent traveler. But their movement was wrong, puppet-like, as if they were being animated by something that didn't understand how human bodies were supposed to function. The railroad worker carried what looked like a railroad spike in one rotting hand, holding it like a weapon. The woman's dress was torn and stained with substances Jake preferred not to identify, and her hair moved in wind that touched nothing else in the still night air. The third figure, the one in modern clothes, was the most disturbing, because Jake recognized him. Billy Henderson, Old Man Henderson's grandson who disappeared 2 weeks ago while checking fence lines. But Billy's eyes were wrong, white and clouded like milk, staring sightlessly at the house while somehow still seeing everything within. His mouth moved constantly, forming words in that unknown language, and Jake realized with horror that the boy was serving as a translator for his companions, converting their ancient tongue into something the modern world could understand. "Jake Morrison." Billy's voice carried clearly through the night air, but the cadence was wrong, the pronunciation too precise for a 20-year-old ranch hand. "Your father fought us for months before we claimed him. You have been more efficient, gathering our enemies together in a single day. We appreciate the convenience." Jake gripped his father's gun tighter, checking the cylinder to ensure it was loaded with the special ammunition Reverend Cole had provided. The bullets had been blessed in sacred fires and inscribed with protective symbols. Whether they would prove effective against whatever animated these corpses remained to be seen. "We know about the sheriff, about the Chinese woman and her grandmother's records, about the preacher and his collection of trinkets." Billy's borrowed voice continued. "Your father believed such things could protect him. His bones decorate our testimony to their effectiveness." Buck's growling intensified, and Jake could see the dog's eyes reflecting the faint starlight like amber coins. Whatever these creatures were, Buck's enhanced senses were cataloging details that would be crucial if they survived the night. "But we are not without mercy," the Billy thing said, and Jake could hear the smile in its voice. "Cease your investigation. Disperse your allies. Forget what you have learned. In exchange, we will grant you the same ignorance that has allowed this town to prosper for 30 years. Continue your father's foolish crusade, and you will join him in our collection before the next full moon." Jake moved away from the window and positioned himself where he could cover both the front and back doors. The creatures outside might be animated corpses, but they were intelligent enough to coordinate their threats and patient enough to conduct surveillance. That suggested they had strategic capabilities beyond simple, mindless hunger. The scraping, shuffling sounds began moving around the house again, but now they were accompanied by new noises. The sound of claws or tools scraping against wooden siding, testing the strength of windows and doors. Jake realized they were conducting reconnaissance, mapping his defenses for a future assault. Tonight was about intimidation and information gathering. The real attack would come later, when they'd identified weaknesses and planned their approach. New voice joined the whispered conversation outside, speaking in the same unknown language, but with different inflections. Jake caught glimpses through various windows of additional figures materializing from the desert darkness. More victims pressed into service as soldiers in an army of the dead. He counted at least 6 distinct forms, representing different time, periods and circumstances of death, all united now in service to whatever force controlled the bone nest. "Interesting," Billy's voice observed from directly outside the front door. "The old sheriff's house is well built, good wood, solid construction. It would take considerable effort to breach without alerting the entire town. But there are other ways to encourage cooperation." Jake heard the sound of something being placed on his porch, followed by the scratch of a match being struck. Light flickered through the gap under his door, accompanied by the acrid smell of something burning. But it wasn't his house they were targeting. It was something else, something that made Buck whine in distress. Moving to the front window again, Jake saw that they'd ignited a small pile of objects on his porch. As the flames grew higher, he could make out individual items. A child's doll, a woman's hairbrush, a man's pocket watch, personal effects that had once belonged to the victims memorialized in the bone nest. The message was unmistakable. Continue the investigation, and more people would disappear. More personal treasures would fuel their ceremonial fires. The flames died as quickly as they'd been lit, leaving only a pile of ash that the night wind scattered across Jake's yard. The voices faded into silence, and the shuffling footsteps retreated toward the desert. But Jake knew they weren't gone. They were simply withdrawing to observe his response, to see whether fear or determination would guide his next moves. Buck remained alert for another hour, monitoring sounds and scents that gradually returned to normal desert night patterns. When the dog finally relaxed enough to lie down, Jake knew their visitors had truly departed. But the memory of Billy Henderson's wrong eyes and puppet-like movements would haunt his dreams for whatever time remained. To him, Jake didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in his kitchen with his father's Colt on the table, and Buck curled at his feet, planning their next move. The visit from the animated corpses had confirmed his worst fears. They weren't dealing with a mindless predator, but with an intelligent force capable of long-term strategy and psychological warfare. The enemy knew about their investigation, had identified their allies, and possessed resources that included an army of the previously dead. But the confrontation had also revealed weaknesses. The creatures had chosen intimidation over direct attack, suggesting they weren't invulnerable. They targeted his house specifically, which meant they saw him as the primary threat. Most importantly, they'd felt compelled to deliver warnings rather than simply killing him, which suggested they operated within certain constraints or limitations. At dawn, Jake made his way to town for an emergency meeting with Sheriff Bradley. They gathered in the church, where Reverend Cole's collection of protective artifacts might provide some spiritual security for their planning session. Sarah arrived, carrying her grandmother's records and a thermos of coffee strong enough to fuel a locomotive. Buck settled near the door, positioning himself to monitor approaching threats. "They came to see me too," Sarah reported without preamble. 3 of them, standing in the street outside the store like they were window shopping. One of them was Maria Santos. She disappeared last spring. She looked right through the window at me and smiled, but her eyes were completely white. "Sheriff." Bradley set his coffee cup down with shaking hands. "I haven't seen them yet, but I found evidence they'd been around the jail. Scratches on the door, footprints in the dirt that didn't match any living person's gait. They're watching all of us." Reverend Cole nodded grimly. "The spiritual atmosphere in town has changed. I can feel it during morning prayers. A heaviness that wasn't there before, like the air itself has been corrupted. Whatever controls these creatures is growing stronger." Jake pulled out his father's journal and placed it open on the church altar. "According to this, my father believed they were building toward something specific. The disappearances aren't random hunting. They're collecting materials for some kind of construction or ritual. The bone nest is just the visible part." Sarah spread her grandmother's map across the altar beside the journal, weighing down the corners with protective crosses from Cole's collection. "Look at the pattern of disappearances over the past 30 years. They're not just taking people, they're taking specific people. Railroad workers, travelers from the east, people with no deep roots in the community who won't be missed immediately." Bradley studied the map with a lawman's eye for detail. "That's smart strategy. Take the people whose absence won't trigger immediate searches, whose families live too far away to investigate personally. By the time anyone realizes they're missing, the trail is cold." "But they've been accelerating," Jake observed, tracing the increasing frequency of red marks on the map. 3 disappearances in the past year, compared to maybe 1 every 2 or 3 years in previous decades. They're approaching some kind of completion. Cole reached into his collection and withdrew an artifact Jake hadn't seen before, a leather-bound book written in multiple languages, its pages filled with sketches and diagrams that depicted various types of supernatural threats. The book looked ancient, its binding held together with wire and determination. This belonged to a missionary who traveled through Arizona Territory in the 1860s, Cole explained. Father Miguel Vasquez documented encounters with what he called the walking hunger, entities that consumed human life force and used the empty bodies as servants. According to his research, they require a specific number of victims to achieve full manifestation. Jake leaned closer to examine the book's illustrations. One page showed a diagram remarkably similar to the bone nest, but larger and more elaborate. Another depicted humanoid figures with white eyes standing in formation around what looked like a ritual circle. The text was primarily in Spanish and Latin, but someone had added English translations in the margins. 50 souls, Cole read from one of the translated passages. The walking hunger requires 50 complete souls to manifest its true form in the physical world. Until that number is reached, it remains partially bound to the spiritual realm, able to animate the dead, but not to exist independently. Sarah's face went pale as she counted the marks on her grandmother's map. 47, she whispered. There are 47 documented disappearances over the past 30 years. The implications hit them all simultaneously. 3 more victims and whatever controlled the bone nest would achieve full physical manifestation. The recent acceleration in disappearances suggested they were actively working toward that goal, and Jake's investigation might have prompted them to abandon caution in favor of speed. "We need to evacuate the town," Bradley said. "Get everyone to safety before they complete their collection." Jake shook his head. Where would they go? This thing has been operating across 3 territories for decades. Running would just spread the victims across a wider area and make them easier to pick off. Our only chance is to stop it here now, before it reaches full strength. But how? Do we fight something like this? Sarah asked. My grandmother's records show that people have been trying to stop it for decades without success. Cole turned several pages in the missionary's book, revealing detailed instructions for what appeared to be a cleansing ritual. The text described a complex procedure involving blessed weapons, sacred fires, and the systematic destruction of the entity's physical anchors in the world of the living. According to Father Vasquez, the walking hunger can be destroyed if you eliminate its connection to the victims it's consumed, destroy the bone nest, consecrate the ground with sacred fire, and release the trapped souls from service. Without their animating force, the entity loses its ability to maintain physical presence. Jake studied the ritual instructions, noting how they aligned with his father's journal entries about sacred fires and blessed ammunition. My father was preparing for this same kind of assault. He had the knowledge and the tools, but he ran out of time because he was working alone, Sarah pointed out. This time we have multiple people, better preparation, and 30 years of accumulated evidence about how this thing operates. Buck suddenly stood and moved to the window, his alert posture indicating approaching danger. Through the glass, they could see townspeople going about their morning business. Mrs. Patterson sweeping her porch, Doc Jameson making his rounds, children playing in the dusty street. Normal life continuing in ignorant bliss, while supernatural predators planned their final harvest. We need to move quickly, Jake decided. If they're down to needing only 3 more victims, they'll probably try to complete their collection within the next few days. The longer we wait, the stronger they become, and the more desperate their tactics will be. Bradley checked his sidearm and ensured he had a full supply of Cole's blessed ammunition. What's the plan? Jake gathered the journal, map, and missionary's book, feeling the weight of inherited responsibility settling on his shoulders. We go back to the bone nest tonight, when they're strongest but also most vulnerable. We perform this cleansing ritual and end what my father started 30 years ago. The plan was dangerous to the point of being nearly suicidal, but it was their only chance to save the town and prevent whatever horror would emerge when the walking hunger reached its full power. As they prepared to leave the church, Jake caught sight of his reflection in the stained glass window, and for a moment saw his father's face looking back at him, nodding approval for the fight ahead. They were loading supplies into Bradley's wagon. When old man Henderson arrived at the church, his weathered face etched with the kind of grief that comes from losing the last connection to hope. Jake had known Henderson for over 20 years, had watched him bury 3 wives, and struggled to keep his ranch running with an aging body and dwindling resources. The old man's presence here now felt like an omen. "Jake, I heard you were asking." "Questions about Billy," Henderson said, his voice cracking with emotion. "My grandson. They took him 2 weeks ago, didn't they? He's one of those things walking around out there." Jake's heart went out to the old man, but there wasn't time for gentle explanations. "Mr. Henderson, I'm sorry, but you need to get somewhere safe. We think they're going to try to take more people soon, and I know what they are," Henderson interrupted, his tone shifting from grief to something harder. "I've known for 30 years, known and done nothing, and now it's cost me the last person I loved." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Sarah and Bradley stopped loading supplies, sensing the sudden tension in the air. Buck moved closer to Jake's side, his hackles beginning to rise as he detected something wrong in Henderson's scent or manner. Henderson reached into his coat and withdrew a leather-wrapped bundle, setting it carefully on the wagon's tailgate. As he unwrapped it, Jake saw another copy of his father's journal, identical in every detail, except that this one was filled with different handwriting. "Samuel Henderson, Ranch Foreman, Territory of Arizona, 1887, Jake read from the cover. "My God, you were there. You knew my father. Knew him, worked with him, watched him die because I was too much of a coward to help when it mattered." Henderson's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Your father asked me to help him destroy the bone nest 30 years ago, asked me to stand with him against something that had been taking my neighbors and friends for years, and I said no." Sarah moved closer, her grandmother's records clutched in her hands. "But why? If you knew what was happening, why didn't you help stop it?" Henderson's laugh was bitter as desert wind. "Because I was young and scared and thought I could make a deal with the devil, the entity that controls the bone nest. It offered me a bargain. My ranch would prosper, my cattle would thrive, my family would be protected from disease and disaster. All I had to do was stay quiet when people disappeared, ensure that any investigation stayed superficial." Jake felt his worldview shifting like sand beneath his feet. Henderson's ranch had indeed prospered over the decades, his cattle bringing higher prices than anyone else's, his land somehow immune to the droughts and plagues that had devastated neighboring spreads. Jake had always attributed it to good management and lucky timing, never suspecting a supernatural arrangement. "The entity kept its word," Henderson continued. "My ranch became the most successful in 3 counties. My wives lived long, healthy lives until natural age took them. My children grew up strong and smart, though they all moved away as soon as they could. And for 30 years, I told myself I'd made the right choice." Bradley's hand had moved to his gun, not yet drawing, but ready for trouble. "What changed your mind?" "Billy," Henderson said simply. "My grandson came back to help run the ranch, the first family member to stay in 20 years. He was going to inherit everything, carry on the Henderson name. But the entity had been patient all these decades, and when it came time to collect final payment for its protection, it took the only thing I had left to lose." Jake studied Henderson's journal, noting how the entries documented the same disappearances his father had tracked, but from the perspective of someone who'd known they were coming. Henderson had recorded which travelers were most vulnerable, which routes would leave them exposed to predators, which times of year the entity was most active. He'd been feeding intelligence to the enemy for 3 decades. "You're the reason. My father died alone," Jake said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "If you'd stood with him, if you'd helped instead of hiding behind your bargain, this could have ended 30 years ago." "Yes," Henderson admitted, "and now Billy pays for my cowardice, and 3 more innocent people will die because I chose profit over principle. I can't undo those choices, but I can try to make amends." Henderson reached into his wagon and withdrew a wooden crate filled with dynamite, enough explosive to level half the town. "The entity's power comes from the bone nest, from all the death and suffering it's accumulated over the decades. But the nest isn't just built on the surface. It extends deep underground, into caverns that were carved by something that doesn't. Think the way humans do. Cole stepped forward, his face pale with understanding. The missionary's book mentioned underground chambers, places where the entity stores the essence of its victims. If we don't destroy those chambers, the surface ritual won't be enough. Exactly, Henderson confirmed. Your father figured that out just before they killed him. He'd mapped the underground structure, discovered that the visible nest was just the tip of a much larger complex, but he never got the chance to act on that knowledge. Jake examined Henderson's journal more carefully, finding detailed diagrams of tunnels and chambers that extended for hundreds of yards beneath the desert floor. The bone nest sat at the center like a spider in its web, connected to storage areas where the entity apparently kept trophies from each victim. Not just bones and clothing, but somehow the actual life force that had once animated those bodies. These diagrams, Sarah said, studying the pages over Jake's shoulder, they show specific locations where the support pillars are weakest. If we place charges in the right spots, we could bring down the entire complex. That's what I'm hoping, Henderson replied. I can't bring back the people I've failed, including your father and my grandson, but I can ensure this ends tonight, even if it cost me my life in the process. Bradley cleared his throat. Mr. Henderson, with all due respect, this could be another trap. How do we know you're not still working with this entity, leading us into an ambush? Henderson nodded, apparently expecting the question. Because the entity no longer trusts me. When Billy disappeared, I started asking questions, making inquiries about ways to break our agreement. It sent Billy to visit me 3 nights ago, my own grandson, walking around with those horrible white eyes, delivering threats in that thing's voice. It told me that my usefulness had ended, that I'd become a liability who knew too much. The old man's voice broke completely. It made Billy tell me exactly how it was going to kill me, using my grandson's voice to describe my own death. That's when I knew there was no honor in bargains made with evil, no matter how profitable they might be. Jake felt his anger toward Henderson shifting into something more complex. Not forgiveness, exactly, but understanding. Fear and grief could drive good people into terrible choices, and living with those choices for decades was its own form of punishment. What mattered now was whether Henderson's information was accurate and whether his commitment to redemption was genuine. The charges need to be placed precisely, Henderson continued, opening the crate to reveal sticks of dynamite wrapped with timer fuses. Too shallow, and we only damage the surface structure. Too deep, and we risk collapsing the tunnels before we can escape. But I've been planning this for weeks, ever since Billy disappeared. I know exactly where each charge needs to go. Buck had been unusually quiet during Henderson's confession, but now the dog moved to sniff the crate of explosives. After a moment, he sat down and looked at Jake with what seemed like approval, whatever Buck's enhanced senses told him about. Henderson's intentions, the dog apparently decided they were genuine. All right, Jake decided. We use Henderson's information and his explosives, but we go in assuming this could still be a trap, and we watch each other's backs every step of the way. The revelation that Henderson had been complicit in decades of disappearances changed everything about their mission. They weren't just fighting an external enemy, they were dealing with betrayal that reached into the heart of their community. But perhaps that betrayal could be transformed into redemption if Henderson was truly committed to ending what he'd helped perpetuate. As they finished loading the wagon with supplies and explosives, Jake caught Henderson staring toward the desert with an expression of grim determination. The old man had spent 30 years living with the consequences of his choice to prioritize security over justice. Tonight would determine whether that choice could be redeemed through sacrifice or whether some mistakes simply couldn't be undone. The sun was setting as they made final preparations in the church, transforming the sanctuary into a war room, where faith and firepower prepared to meet supernatural evil. Cole had arranged his collection of protective artifacts on the altar like instruments in a surgeon's kit: blessed bullets, iron crosses, vials of holy water, and the ancient missionary's book open to pages detailing the cleansing ritual they would need to perform. Jake stood before the stained glass windows, watching the last light filter through colored glass, while his father's Colt rested heavy in its holster. The weight of the weapon was familiar, comforting in the way that some burdens become part of a man's identity. But tonight, it carried additional significance. It was the same gun his father had carried on his final mission, the weapon that had failed to save John Morrison's life 30 years ago. Henderson worked methodically with the dynamite, checking fuses and calculating blast patterns with the precision of a man who understood that everyone's survival depended on getting the details exactly right. His weathered hands moved with surprising steadiness despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. Sarah sat nearby, copying protective symbols from her grandmother's records onto strips of cloth that could be worn or carried into battle. Bradley cleaned his rifle for the third time, the repetitive motion serving as meditation for a man preparing to face the impossible. Buck lay curled near the church entrance, but his rest was fitful, interrupted by soft whines and occasional growls directed towards sounds only he could hear. The dog's supernatural sensitivity had been their early warning system throughout this crisis, and his increasing agitation suggested their enemies were gathering strength as darkness fell. According to Father Vasquez's notes, Cole said, breaking the contemplative silence, the walking hunger is strongest during the hours around midnight, when the barrier between the physical and spiritual worlds grows thin. But that's also when it's most vulnerable to direct spiritual attack. Jake nodded, checking his pocket watch. 8:30. They had 3.5 hours to reach the bone nest, set the charges, and perform the cleansing ritual before their window of opportunity closed. After that, they would be facing the entity, at full strength, with an army of animated corpses at its command. "I've been thinking about something," Sarah said, looking up from her symbol copying. "My grandmother's records show that the disappearances follow lunar cycles. Most of them happen during the new moon, when the sky is darkest. Tonight is a new moon." Bradley paused in his rifle maintenance. "That means they'll be hunting tonight anyway, even without our interference. We might be walking into their regular feeding time. Or," Henderson suggested grimly, "they might be planning to take their final 3 victims tonight, to complete their collection while the spiritual barriers are at their weakest. Our investigation may have prompted them to accelerate their timeline. The possibility that innocent people might die while they were preparing to prevent future deaths added urgency to an already desperate situation." Jake felt the familiar weight of responsibility that had defined his years as sheriff, the knowledge that other people's lives depended on decisions he would make in the next few hours. Cole reached into his collection and withdrew an artifact Jake hadn't seen before, a small silver bell with engravings that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The bell's surface was tarnished with age, but it emanated the same sense of protection and warmth that characterized the other blessed items. "This belonged to Father Vasquez," Cole explained. "According to his notes, it can disrupt the spiritual bonds that allow the walking hunger to control its victims. Ring it near the animated corpses, and they should collapse back into normal death." Jake accepted the bell, noting how its weight seemed disproportionate to its size, as if it contained more than mere metal and craftsmanship. "Will it work on all of them at once?" The missionary's book suggests it has to be used at the source of their animation, the bone nest itself. Ring it there while performing the cleansing ritual, and all the entity's servants should be released simultaneously. Henderson looked up from his explosive preparations. "That's assuming we can get close enough to the nest to ring a bell. These things aren't going to stand politely aside while we perform our ritual." "Which is why we need the dynamite," Jake replied. "Create enough chaos and destruction to disrupt their coordination, then move in fast for the spiritual cleansing before they can regroup." The plan was dangerous and relied heavily on timing, luck, and the untested effectiveness of artifacts that were decades or centuries old. but it was the only plan they had, and waiting would only give their enemies more time to complete their own preparations. Sarah finished copying the protective symbols and distributed them among the group. Jake tucked his into his shirt pocket next to his father's photograph, creating a small collection of items that connected him to both family history and spiritual protection. The weight of these talismans was oddly reassuring, a reminder that he wasn't facing this battle entirely alone. "I need to tell you all something," Henderson said, his voice heavy with confession. "The entity I made my bargain with 30 years ago, it's not just some desert predator that happened to settle in our territory. It's much older than that, and much more intelligent. It came here for a specific reason." The others turned to face him, sensing that another revelation was coming. Henderson reached into his journal and withdrew a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1862, its headline reading, "Apache Sacred Site Desecrated by Railroad Survey. The bone nest sits on top of an ancient burial ground," Henderson explained. The Apache considered it sacred, a place where the spirits of their ancestors rested in peace. When the railroad company started surveying through the area, they disturbed something that had been sleeping for centuries. Cole leaned forward, his expression grave. "You're saying this entity was awakened by the railroad construction?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. The walking hunger isn't native to our world. It's something that was bound beneath the burial ground by Apache shamans long before white men arrived in the territory. The railroad survey broke those bindings, and the entity has been growing stronger ever since." Jake felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "That's why it targets railroad workers and travelers. It's feeding on the very people who represent the force that freed it from its prison. And it's why the bone nest is built where it is," Sarah added. "It's not just collecting victims, it's corrupting the sacred site that once contained it, turning a place of rest into a foundation for something evil." The revelation added another layer of complexity to their mission. They weren't just fighting a supernatural predator. They were attempting to re-imprison something that had been contained by spiritual traditions far older and more sophisticated than anything they understood. The protective artifacts and cleansing rituals that seemed so powerful suddenly felt inadequate against a force that had required generations of Apache shamans to contain originally. "Do you know how they contained it before?" Bradley asked. Henderson shook his head. "The Apache who knew those rituals were scattered or killed during the Indian Wars. By the time anyone realized what had been unleashed, the knowledge needed to contain it was already lost." Buck suddenly stood and moved to the window, his entire body rigid with alert tension. Outside, the new moon night was darker than usual, with heavy clouds obscuring even the starlight. But Jake could see moving shapes in that darkness, figures that walked with the wrong rhythm they'd observed during the previous night's visit. "They're here," Jake said quietly. "Watching the church." Cole moved to another window, peering carefully through the gap in the curtains. "I count at least 8 of them. They're surrounding the building." "Billy's out there," Henderson said, his voice breaking slightly. "I can see him standing by the cemetery fence." "My grandson turned into a weapon against everything I tried to protect." The sight of the animated corpses gathering around their sanctuary was deeply unsettling, but it also provided valuable intelligence. The enemy was committing significant resources to monitoring their activities, which suggested they were genuinely concerned about the threat Jake's group represented. "They're not attacking," Sarah observed, "just watching." "Why?" Jake checked his father's gun one final time, ensuring the blessed ammunition was properly loaded. "Because they want to see what we're planning. They're gathering intelligence for their own purposes. Or," Henderson said grimly, "they're waiting for us to leave the protection of consecrated ground. The church is still sacred space. They can't enter without invitation." Cole nodded agreement. "But once we step outside, we'll be vulnerable to direct assault. They could try to stop us before we ever reach the bone nest." Jake moved away from the window and faced his companions, an aging preacher, a small town Sheriff, a shopkeeper, and a rancher seeking redemption for decades of cowardice. Not exactly the fellowship of heroes that legends were made of, but they were what stood between their community and an ancient evil that had already claimed too many lives. Then we don't give them that chance, Jake decided. We leave through the back door, move through the cemetery where the consecrated ground extends, and take the long route to the bone nest. Let them watch the church all night if they want. We'll be miles away before they realize we're gone. The plan meant abandoning the wagon and carrying their supplies on foot across 15 miles of desert terrain, but it offered their best chance of reaching the bone nest undetected. As they gathered weapons, explosives, and ritual materials, Jake felt the familiar pre-battle calm settling over him, the state of mind that had carried him through dangerous situations during his years as sheriff. Outside, the assembled corpses continued their patient vigil, unaware that their quarry was already slipping away into the darkness that had once been their ally. They reached the bone nest at 11:40, 20 minutes before the midnight hour, when spiritual barriers would be at their weakest. The structure loomed larger in the darkness than it had appeared during Jake's morning discovery, its collection of human remains seeming to pulse with malevolent life. The skull at the peak had been repositioned to face their approach, as if the entity controlling the nest was aware of their presence and preparing for confrontation. Buck moved ahead of the group, his enhanced senses mapping threats that human perception couldn't detect. The dog's behavior was different now, focused and predatory, as if he understood that the time for reconnaissance had ended and battle was about to begin. His hackles were raised, but his growling had ceased, replaced by the deadly silence of a hunter preparing to strike. Henderson knelt at the edge of the excavation Jake and Buck had created that morning, studying the underground chambers that his journal had mapped in such detail. The dynamite charges were distributed among the 5 of them, each person carrying enough explosive to collapse a different section of the subterranean complex. The plan required precise timing and coordination. Detonate too early, and the entity would escape deeper underground. Too late, and they might be trapped in the collapsing tunnels. The main support chamber is directly beneath the center of the nest, Henderson whispered, pointing toward the skull-crowned peak. That's where I need to place the primary charge. The rest of you handle the secondary supports while I deal with the central structure. Cole clutched Father Vasquez's silver bell in one hand and his blessed rifle in the other, his weathered face set in lines of grim determination. Sarah had arranged the protective symbols from her grandmother's collection in a pattern around their position, creating a spiritual perimeter that might provide some defense against direct supernatural attack. Bradley checked his pocket watch. 11:43. 17 minutes until midnight. As if responding to his words, the desert around them began to change. The temperature dropped despite the lack of wind, and shadows that had no corresponding objects started moving between the sagebrush and rock formations. The bone nest itself began to emit a low humming sound, like the vibration of some massive tuning fork buried deep in the earth. Then they appeared. The animated corpses emerged from the darkness with coordinated precision, surrounding Jake's group in a circle of death that included victims from multiple decades. Billy Henderson stood directly opposite his grandfather, his milk-white eyes reflecting starlight that shouldn't have been visible through the heavy cloud cover. Maria Santos positioned herself to block their retreat toward town, her once beautiful face now bearing the waxy pallor of advanced decay. The railroad worker Jake had seen outside his house carried that metal spike like a spear, while others bore improvised weapons crafted from their own bones and the detritus of the desert. Gentlemen, Billy's voice carried clearly across the space between them, though his lips barely moved. And ladies, you have traveled far tonight to witness the completion of a work 30 years in the making. How thoughtful of you to attend the ceremony. Jake drew his father's Colt, the blessed ammunition feeling reassuringly solid in the chambers. The only ceremony happening tonight is the one that sends you back to hell. Billy's laugh was the sound of wind through an empty skull. Hell, you misunderstand our nature, Sheriff Morrison. We are not demons seeking to corrupt souls. We are builders, architects of transformation. The bone nest you see before you is merely the foundation. Tonight, when the final 3 souls join our collection, the real construction begins. The animated corpses began moving closer, tightening their circle with mechanical precision. Jake could see that each one carried something that had belonged to them in life. Maria clutched a rosary that had turned black with age. The railroad worker wore a conductor's cap that should have rotted decades ago. Others displayed personal items that somehow retained their form, despite the decomposition of their owners. The sacred ground beneath us once contained a force of pure spiritual energy, Billy continued, his borrowed voice growing stronger. Your Apache predecessors used that energy to maintain balance between the physical and spiritual worlds. But balance is static, unchanging. We offer evolution, growth, the transformation of death into purpose. Henderson stepped forward, his face etched with grief and determination. Billy, I know some part of you is still in there. Fight it, boy. Don't let this thing use your voice to spread its poison. Billy's head turned toward his grandfather with predatory focus. Samuel Henderson, the coward who sold his neighbors' lives for 30 years of prosperity. How fitting that you should be here to witness the fruition of your investment. Jake raised his gun, sighting along the barrel at Billy's center mass. The blessed ammunition might not permanently destroy these creatures, but it should disrupt their animation long enough to create an opening. Everybody get ready. When I start shooting, move fast toward your assigned positions. But before he could pull the trigger, the bone nest itself began to move. The careful arrangement of femurs and rib cages started shifting and rearranging, creating openings that led down into the underground chambers Henderson had mapped. The skull at the peak turned to face each member of Jake's group in turn, its empty sockets somehow conveying recognition and anticipation. The nest is awakening, Billy announced. 50 souls have fed its growth over 3 decades, and tonight it prepares to birth something unprecedented in your world. You cannot stop what has already begun, but you can choose to become part of it willingly rather than as mere materials. Cole stepped forward, raising Father Vasquez's silver bell. In the name of all that is holy, I command you to release these souls from bondage. The bell's chime rang across the desert with supernatural clarity, its pure tone cutting through the humming emanation from the bone nest like a blade through rotten cloth. Several of the animated corpses stumbled as the sound washed over them, their coordination disrupted by spiritual forces they couldn't resist. But Billy remained standing, his white eyes fixed on Cole with something that might have been amusement. Interesting. You carry artifacts blessed by indigenous shamans, filtered through European missionary traditions and charged with Protestant faith. A fascinating synthesis of spiritual technologies. Unfortunately, quite inadequate for the forces you face. The bone nest's humming intensified, drowning out any response Cole might have made. Jake realized their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Whatever the entity was building toward would reach completion soon, and their chances of stopping it would disappear with the midnight hour. Now! Jake shouted, pulling the trigger on his father's gun. The blessed bullet struck Billy Henderson's center mass, and the young man's body crumpled like a marionette with severed strings. But even as he fell, his voice continued speaking, the words emerging from empty air as the entity demonstrated that it no longer needed physical vessels to communicate. Impressive. Your father's ammunition retains its spiritual charge after 30 years of storage. But you misunderstand the nature of our construction. Jake was already moving, diving toward the bone nest, while Bradley and Sarah laid down covering fire with their own blessed ammunition. The animated corpses stumbled and fell as the spiritual weapons disrupted their animating force. But Jake could see them already beginning to stir again. The blessed bullets bought them time, not victory. Henderson reached the central opening in the bone nest and began descending into the underground chambers, his dynamite charge clutched in weathered hands that shook with determination rather than fear. Cole followed close behind, chanting prayers in Latin while carrying Father Vasquez's ritual materials toward the heart of the spiritual corruption. The underground chambers were worse than anything Henderson's journal had described. The walls were lined with human remains, arranged in intricate patterns that hurt to look at directly, while the air itself seemed thick with the accumulated anguish of decades of victims. But most disturbing was the sound, a rhythmic pulsing that suggested something vast and alien breathing in the depths below. "The primary chamber is just ahead," Henderson called back to Cole. "But Reverend, what I'm seeing doesn't match my maps. This place has been growing, changing, preparing for something bigger than I understood." They emerged into a cavern that defied the geological laws of the desert above. The space was far too large to exist beneath the bone nest, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. At the center of the chamber, a new structure was taking shape, something that made the surface bone nest look like a child's toy by comparison. Hundreds of human skeletons were arranged in a spiral pattern that climbed toward the cavern's invisible ceiling, each one positioned with mathematical precision to create a framework of death that pulsed with unnatural life. The missing organs and flesh hadn't simply decayed. They had been transformed into something that resembled living tissue, but operated according to different biological rules. "Dear God," Cole whispered. "It's building itself a body." The entity's voice echoed from every surface simultaneously. The human form, perfected through the integration of 50 complete life forces. Your Apache predecessors imprisoned raw spiritual energy beneath this ground, but they lacked the vision to utilize it constructively. We have spent 3 decades learning to shape that energy into something unprecedented. Henderson placed his dynamite charge at the base of the skeletal construction and began setting the timer. "Whatever you're building, it ends tonight. Does it? Your explosives will destroy this particular construction, but the spiritual energy that powers it will simply relocate to another site, begin again with a new design. You cannot destroy energy, Samuel Henderson. You can only redirect it." Above them, Jake could hear the battle continuing as Bradley and Sarah fought to keep the animated corpses from following them into the underground chambers. Buck's barking echoed down through the openings, suggesting the dog was engaging threats that his enhanced senses could perceive, but human eyes could not. Cole began the cleansing ritual described in Father Vasquez's book, spreading blessed salt in a circle around the skeletal construction while chanting words in languages that predated European settlement of the territory. The silver bell rang continuously now, its pure tone creating visible distortions in the air as spiritual and physical realities clashed. 30 seconds on the timer, Henderson reported. "Reverend, whatever you're going to do it fast." The skeletal construction began to move, individual bones shifting and rotating as the entity attempted to accelerate its manifestation process. The missing flesh wasn't absent. Jake realized with horror that it was forming in real time, spiritual energy coalescing into something that resembled muscle and sinew, but operated according to alien principles. Cole raised Father Vasquez's cross above his head, and the chamber filled with light that seemed to come from within the metal itself. By the authority of sacred ground desecrated, by the power of souls imprisoned unjustly, by the faith of those who died fighting this corruption, I command you to release your hold on this place. The entity's response was a shriek that seemed to come from the earth itself, a sound of pure rage and frustration that made the cavern walls tremble. The skeletal construction began to collapse as the spiritual bonds holding it together were severed by forces older and more fundamental than its stolen power. 10 seconds, Henderson called. Jake grabbed Cole's arm and pulled the preacher toward the chamber entrance. Behind them, the entity's partially manifested form thrashed in the dissolving framework of bones, no longer able to maintain physical coherence as the cleansing ritual stripped away its accumulated power. They reached the surface just as Henderson's charges detonated in sequence throughout the underground complex. The bone nest collapsed into itself, with a sound like the world's largest church bell cracking, while spiritual light erupted from every opening in patterns that briefly outlined the true scope of the construction that had been hidden beneath. The desert, the animated corpses around the site simply stopped moving, their bodies finally allowed to rest as the force controlling them was severed from the physical world. Billy Henderson collapsed peacefully near his grandfather's feet, his face restored to its normal color and his eyes closed in what looked like genuine sleep. Buck emerged from the settling dust and debris, his tail wagging for the first time. In days, the dog's relaxed posture confirmed what Jake's other senses were telling him. The supernatural threat that had haunted this desert for 30 years was finally gone. As the dust settled and the spiritual light faded, Jake stood among the ruins of the bone nest, with his father's photograph in one hand and the protective cross in the other. The fight that John Morrison had died attempting to finish was finally complete. The inherited duty passed from father to son finally fulfilled. The desert was quiet now, filled with the kind of peace that comes after a long fever finally breaks. 3 weeks after the destruction of the bone nest, Jake Morrison sat on his front porch, watching the desert sunrise paint the eastern sky in shades of gold and rose. Buck lay beside his chair, no longer the anxious, restless animal who had led him into the wasteland that morning, but a contented companion whose primary concern was whether his breakfast would arrive on schedule. The dog's transformation mirrored Jake's own. The weight of inherited duty finally lifted, replaced by something that felt remarkably like peace. The town of Dry Creek had begun to change in subtle ways since that night. Doc Jameson reported that several families who had lost relatives over the years were finally able to sleep without the nightmares that had haunted them for decades. Children played later in the evening without the inexplicable dread that had kept them close to home after sunset. Even the desert itself seemed different, more welcoming, less hostile to travelers who ventured beyond the established trails. Sarah, Jen, had taken over as unofficial town historian, organizing her grandmother's records into a proper archive that documented not just the disappearances, but the eventual resolution of the mystery that had plagued the territory for 30 years. She'd convinced the territorial government to establish a small monument at the site where the bone nest had stood, honoring both the victims and those who had died fighting to stop their killer. Sheriff Bradley had grown into his role with new confidence, no longer feeling like he was merely maintaining order in a dying town, but actively protecting a community that had reclaimed its future. The badge carried different weight now, still heavy with responsibility, but no longer burdened by secrets too dangerous to investigate. Old Man Henderson had surprised everyone by how gracefully he bore the aftermath of his confessions. Rather than retreating into guilt and self-recrimination, he'd become something of a counselor for other people struggling with choices they'd made during desperate times. His ranch continued to prosper, but now he shared that prosperity with neighbors who needed help, as if 30 years of supernatural protection had finally taught him the true value of community. Reverend Cole conducted a special memorial service for Billy Henderson and all the other victims whose remains had been recovered from the underground chambers. The young man was buried in the church cemetery with a headstone that read simply, William Henderson, 1875-1895, beloved grandson, finally at rest. The service drew people from 3 counties, many of them family members who had never known. What happened to their missing loved ones? Jake kept his father's journal and badge in a place of honor on his mantelpiece, next to the protective cross that had helped them survive that final confrontation. But the artifacts that meant the most to him now were simpler things. A new photograph of Buck taken in full sunlight, his tail wagging and his eyes bright with contentment. A letter from the territorial marshal commending the group's actions and officially closing dozens of missing persons cases. A small wooden cross that Reverend Cole had carved from timber taken from the old church, blessing it with prayers of gratitude rather than protection. This final artifact represented something Jake hadn't expected to find at the end of his investigation. The understanding that some inheritances were worth receiving, even when they came with terrible costs. His father's sense of duty, his commitment to protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, his willingness to sacrifice personal safety for the greater good. These were legacies that had shaped Jake's life in positive ways, even when the specific fight that defined them had remained unfinished. On quiet mornings like this one, Jake sometimes felt his father's presence in the desert wind, not as a restless ghost seeking resolution, but as a satisfied spirit finally able to rest. The photograph on his mantelpiece seemed to radiate approval rather than challenge, as if John Morrison was content to see his son carry forward the best parts of their family's tradition while leaving the burdens buried in the desert where they belonged. The territorial newspaper had run a story about the group's victory, though the editor had been careful to frame it in terms that wouldn't sound too fantastical to readers who hadn't witnessed the supernatural elements firsthand. Local citizens solve decades-old mystery was the headline, with a subtitle explaining how years of patient investigation finally bring closure to missing persons cases. The article focused on the human courage and community cooperation that had made their success possible, treating the more extraordinary aspects as colorful local folklore. Jake didn't mind the sanitized version of events. The people who needed to know the full truth, the families of victims, the other law enforcement officials who might face similar situations, the spiritual leaders who understood that faith sometimes required practical action, all of them had access to complete accounts. For everyone else, it was enough to know that their community was safe again, that the long nightmare of unexplained disappearances was finally over. Buck stirred beside his chair, lifting his head toward the desert with alert but unthreatened. Attention! A rider was approaching from the direction of town, Sheriff Bradley making his weekly visit to check on Jake's well-being and share coffee that was strong enough to dissolve horseshoes. The routine had become a comfortable rhythm in both their lives, a way of maintaining the bonds forged during their night of shared danger. As Bradley's horse crested the small rise that separated Jake's property from the main road, Jake reflected on how much his understanding of courage had evolved over the past month. Real bravery wasn't the absence of fear, it was the decision to act despite fear when action was necessary to protect something valuable. His father had possessed that kind of courage, as had Sarah, Cole, Henderson, and Bradley when the moment of testing arrived. The desert stretched endlessly toward the horizon, vast and eternal and peaceful in the way that only comes when ancient wrongs have been set right. Jake Morrison had inherited his father's fight and finished it, passing on to future generations a legacy of duty fulfilled rather than duty deferred. The badge and gun that had defined John Morrison's life were museum pieces now, symbols of a particular kind of heroism that belonged to a specific time and place, but the values those tools had served, justice, protection, the belief that some fights were worth any sacrifice, those would endure as long as people were willing to stand up for what was right, even when the cost was higher than anyone should have to pay. Jake raised his coffee cup toward the sunrise, a quiet toast to his father's memory and a promise to the future that the lessons learned in the desert would not be forgotten. Buck wagged, his tail in apparent approval, and somewhere in the warming air, Jake could have sworn he heard the distant sound of John Morrison's approving laughter.